Hey folks, this is ACAT with Charts for sharkcharts.live, and this is part 4 of my ACAT mini-series, Settings, Custom Band, Labels. This is the Everything Else video. The previous pair of videos cover the two core components of ACAT, and this is the video where I kind of go through everything else that's particularly important. So it's going to cover a wide variety of different things. The fifth video on high-res ACAT is going to be pretty limited and specific to just high-res ACAT. I want to start this video by going through the settings menu once from top to bottom because it's long. It's a couple pages and it's impenetrable, I think, to the average person who opens it for the first time. And it isn't actually all that complicated. A lot of things are repeated just for each of the different bands. There aren't actually all that many settings beyond that are all that important for you to mess with. But I want to just go through that from top to bottom and explain it. And then I've got a bunch of tabs open with the different examples of things I want to talk about that you can change about ACAT that aren't just the mean reversion moving average and compression moving average core parts of this indicator. So I have here just a default load of ACAT 14 to 600 standard res on BTC USD. If we open the settings menu, it is several pages. The first thing that shows up is the drop-down menu for behavior when max period reached. I thought it was important enough to put right at the top, because if you want to weave this with other period lengths of ACAT, then you're going to need to mess with this immediately. So for the non-high-res versions of ACAT, which we're going to assume you're going to weave them, the non-high-res versions will be by default set to display warning color. If you want to use multiple ACAT lengths, you'll want to set this to hide until tracking resets so that they seamlessly track. Reset tracking immediately is an option in there that I don't think you'll want to use very often. What it does is if it gets to the next period length, it'll reset the oscillator, or reset the band immediately. But in general, that means it's still overexpanded and still expanding. So you'll get kind of a stuttery band until it's done overexpanding. But it is something that's functionally coded into the indicator, so it's an option. Periods for oscillator lookback is a core part of the wave PM calculation. I've explained it on other videos about wave PM, but 100 is probably something you want to just leave this at in almost any case. You can mess around with different time frames probably before you'd want to mess with the oscillator lookback. But if you want to know more about how that affects wave PM, please look at the other videos I have on wave PM itself for the background theory. Source is straightforward. Normalize to point value instead of source. This is a setting I put in the various indicators that allows you to switch between the way, strictly speaking, the Mark Whistler's version of wave PM calculates the indicator, where it has a normalization step that to just the minimum point value on the instrument, which is a constant, as opposed to how I have it coded up to work by default, which is that same normalization step but to current price. This is very in the weeds. That normalization step I think is very important for larger time frames where over the period that standard deviation is calculated, there are going to be quite a bit of movement and price as a multiple of itself. And I found anecdotally that I've gotten better results in general, better readings in general, by having it normalized over price instead of minimum point value. But you are free to check this box and compare, and I have one of the tabs that'll be coming up. Check to allow Wix's mean reversion, uncheck to require candle close the class mean. Straightforward. Generally speaking, I want to keep the trend that's currently displaying if it only gets wicked at mean reversion, because frequently that means it's bouncing mean reversion if it can't close a candle across. And it doesn't necessarily mean that trend is continuing on that given period length. You can get a situation where it then goes back to tests the top of the containment zone is a good spot, and then comes back down and crosses. But frequently when it does break out, that period length is still relevant. So I generally want to keep it. So I would like to see a candle close across mean reversion if I'm using that setting to reset lock speed bands. Check a lower maximum period length is an option if even 600 is too high period length for what you really want to look at. So say you wanted to really only look at expansions under 200 or 300 periods, you would be able to set that lower here. The higher period length versions of ACAT also allow you to set a lower maximum period length. If you wanted 1,000 instead of 2,000, you can do that. As I've stated in the previously, I generally prefer to see the longer period lengths if they're getting tracked, as I use these indicators myself. But if you're specifically looking at local price action, you may not want to. So from here on, we have repeated sets of options for each set of bands, and they're very similar to each other. So even though it's really long, it gets a lot simpler from here. For the LOXP, TLCP, and CLBC bands, the first track box is a master switch for the bands. It does display the mean, and the first set of bands is with the mean are the only places where there is a fill drawn. So if you were to go from the mean to the third set without any of these other ones checked, you would not get a fill. I have made the different band widths customizable. By default, they're the 1.25, 2.2, and 3.2 distances that come from Whistler. Notably, Whistler in relation specifically to institutional benchmarks. But in our experience making this indicator, we found that those period lengths are important on the dynamic moving averages as well. From here, we have the different ways you can reset the LOXP bands. By default, reset it after mean reversion. You can reset it after a wave PM threshold is crossed down. You can reset it after a set number of bars. I gave this with examples in the mean reversion moving average video. The main thing to note here is that you can actually check these in combination if you want. If you uncheck all of them, it'll just keep tracking to whatever the longest overextended period ever is and never have a reset condition. So you want to have at least one of these checked. though you can mix and match to combine them if you'd like. Longest compressed period, very similar. Works basically the same as the LOXP settings. The one thing is that I don't include a way to reset it based on a threshold, because that doesn't make the same theoretical sense that it does for the longest overexpanded period, because we're expecting that the reason it's relevant is because we can see expansion up to about that period, but then there's a volatility overhead border. But you can reset it after a certain number of bars, or you can reset it after it crosses the TLCP mean. Current longest overexpanded or longest compressed period, identical to the above, except there's no reset conditions at all, because it automatically turns off as soon as there's no longer a compressed period. So this gets us into things we haven't discussed, and will be discussed with examples later in this video. But I'll go over the settings for them briefly now. The custom band type. So we used to have a fourth band that was specifically used as a toggleable band to display the previous longest overexpanded period. And the reason for that, that specific use case, is we'll get to some charts where you get a mean reversion, but it's a high enough period length and seems significant enough that you expect that band to still be relevant for a while. So we had that as a fixed band you could turn on and off in previous versions of mean reversion moving average. What I did is I used the same plots that I was using for that, just make a customizable band so that you can do more things with it. Of which examples in a few tabs. But you can set it now to LOXP, previous LOXP, TLCP, previous TLCP, or even just a custom fixed period length like a BB Mailmax band. You can then have that band multiplied by a factor. So part of why the big reason we made this change is to make it possible to track instead bands for 1/10 of the longest overexpanded period. For that, you would want to multiply the period length by 0.1, check the box for multiplied period length by the factor, and I have found that you want to have a minimum cap on what it actually displays, because getting like the 3 moving average is not a useful band. Unlike the other bands, if you untrack show custom track mean, that mean will turn off without being a master switch for the others, because this band is intended to be particularly flexible. Which ones standard deviation bands you want to show, and if you want to experiment with more distances, is really going to depend on what you actually want to use this band for. By default, it's set not to use this band at all. So if it's a kind of a blank slate, and certainly if you have ideas for things you would like to use this band for that would calculate off of the things we're tracking anyway with this indicator, feel free to suggest them in the Discord, and I can tell you how easy it would be to add them to the drop-down menu. So after that, we get to everything related to the labels that were introduced in PineScript version 4. There is a master switch for displaying labels as its own checkbox. By default, the display current LOXP, display current TLCP, mute new TLCP labels while still compressing, and display current CLCP label are turned on. So by default, it's showing the most recent label for a band, assuming that the band is present. The band is tracking something. You can turn on displaying the past labels the reason they're not turned on by default is because it very much crowds your chart. And I have that as a leader tab to show what's up with all that. Something to realize about these labels is that there isn't just an easy way to weave them together on different indicator instances, or even different labels at different heights, but specifically anchored to bars. So you have to have some type of price-related formula to try to weave these. And having that not lead to total chaos and overlapping across timeframes and instruments turns out to be a really hard problem. And I have a solution that I think is about as good as I can get it without going absolutely insane. Again, I've got examples later. But that is going to be what all of these settings largely are. Where base separation of labels from price and vertical separation distance between label types. Those are arbitrary units. Those are basically, but they relate to how far from price the labels print. Tiers to say which order the different labels print so they don't overlap each other. Minimum bar count for new labels on the compressing periods because they have a much more, because they continuously increase in a way that LoxP labels don't, because the LoxP labels LoxP is more discrete, and they have a propensity to cross repeatedly across the mean when they're range trading, to avoid just having the thing spam a bunch of labels. I have a backstop of a minimum number of bars you have to get before it will print a new one. That's also what the mute new TLCP labels while still compressing is relevant to avoid just getting spammed with labels if you're looking at past TLCP labels based on the dynamics of how compression works. So this last checkbox, display current summary panel, is something else, and I've got a tab displaying it. It's when you see it, you'll wonder why it's not just on by default, and it's not on by default because it's the way it works is a massive kludge, and it has a tendency to freeze and lag out, and I'll get to that when I show it. The last few settings are related to where you would display the summary panel relative to current price, as well as weaving them if you have multiple ACAT scripts running. Okay, so that's the settings menu. Let's start going through the odds and ends of this indicator. So the first two are actually from the settings. This is my way of going over a couple of the other resolutions I have. So this is what it looks like by default, and from what we've seen previously, similar to just what's on the splash screen for this indicator. And this is ACAT 14 to 2000 half res. We can actually turn off 2000 to 4000 on BTC USD just for the sake of making this clearer, because it's not actually tracking anything on this 4-hour chart at the moment. If you want to use just one indicator that gets all the way to 2000 period, the half res version of ACAT can do that. And it is, as it sounds, it tracks half the precision, roughly speaking, of at the two 14 to 600 period and 600 to 2000 period ACATs together. The way we picked 14 to 600 and 600 to 2000 was semi-arbitrary based on how 3D Wave PM was coded at first for what its maximum period length is. And it turned out that when we made the mean reversion movie average the first time, that actually the way we had it coded then, having the full length scan all the 2000, while useful in some cases, was really laggy. As we got the indicator less laggy and more able to load the higher period lengths, I still wanted to maintain the same level of resolution as the standard baseline, and that requires breaking it up into 2 indicators. ACAT half res is my attempt to allow somebody to go all the way from 14 to 2000 while only having 1 indicator on their chart. There is a trade-off, and I think it's a pretty significant trade-off, and it's related to how much sawtoothing you get when tracking compression mean standard bands. This sawtoothing is because it's recognizing in larger gaps that we've reached further mean for compression. And you can eyeball this and say that this band generally, the middle of the sawtoothing, is about where the actual barrier, if you had perfect precision, is. But especially with large expansions or stuff like this, lower time frames, this gets crowded and difficult to look at. And I don't prefer to use 1 indicator usually because of this. I don't think it's precise enough for my use case, and it's kind of a pain to look at because it crowds so much space. And I do use the compression bands. If you don't use them at all, it's not much of a problem. Precision's pretty similar on lock speed by contrast. And you can kind of just see the side by side of how much sawtoothing there is here versus here. High-res ACAT will largely get rid of the sawtoothing altogether. And we'll get to that in the 5th video of the series. The other thing we have is just this example for when you would use 2000 to 4000 ACAT. And the answer to that is rarely, probably, because that's actually an awful lot of bars. And you rarely are that overexpanded. But ETHUSD on the 4-hour chart is a poster child for one where that is actually the case, where because it had such a crazy run-up and crash, the relative period length it expanded to was just dramatic. And it maxed out 2,004 hour bars. Realize that 2,004 hour bars is almost a year. That's how long the look back is for 2,004 hour bars, which is part of why you usually would just want to go to a higher time frame. But it is nice to have the precision to calculate this stuff from a lower time frame, when you run into the situation, and not have to leave the 4-hour chart altogether. So what that looks like side by side, or above and below, because I'm comparing a larger length of time than the previous panel, you can see that this mean was not the important place we reached out to. We in fact did mean revert basically to what was predicted, with the caveat that the amount of actual price history for ETHUSD pairs is not that much longer than the year that it takes to calculate a mean of the 2000s, Loxp of 2,675. So if you go into individual ETHUSD charts, this pivot could end up in meaningfully different places. I trust the average of fiat exchange chart best for picking out something like this, but it is a bit eye of the beholder because it's at the border of how much price history there actually is. But it did turn out to be really relevant as to where price actually started rejecting at first, and where it what it was able to cross as mean reversion before having its kind of final leg of this expansion. This happens to be a good example of the fact that when you have multiple ACAT at different period lengths, you can get the different indicators tracking individually, such that even though we have the longest overexpanded defined all the way up on ACAT 2000 to 4000, these other bands are still looking for lesser overexpansions that are within their range once they've managed to reset. So in this case, we get several sets of overexpansions that do actually all turn out to be pretty relevant to how price action on ETHUSD actually tracked, because we've got multiple instances of ACAT that are independently seeing overexpansions within the range that they track. This is just a pretty nice example because we mean reverted then the large drop across a large part of 2018, and then we had this smaller, more recent overexpansion. It got to the 3.2 band of that, and that's where it topped out. So, moving on. So, in this case, I've come back to our baseline BTC USD chart, and this is the side-by-side comparison for changing the tick minimum basis between the default source normalization versus point normalization. And it gives me an opportunity to make my pitch that the source normalization is more useful. You can look at charts on different time frames, different charts, and find examples where the source normalization gave you better touches. Yeah, this area here is definitely one of them. But the target for mean reversion was meaningfully different with the source or the point normalization in the original Whistler calculation versus the source normalization that I do. And I think based on the resulting price action that came out, it's pretty clear that this was a more useful mean to know about. When this actually had its extremely volatile pump, more than 1,000 in a very short period of time, the mean where it found resistance and eventually crossed was predicted for the source normalization. It's not that this mean wasn't relevant at all, because certainly we got a volatile pop to hit it here, and from that point we had a new trend. But most touches here, I'd say, are better respectful of what's predicted with the source normalization. Especially with the compression bands, you'll notice there's just dramatically less movement in the compression bands with source normalization, or with point normalization than there is in source. And if we when we went through the compression moving average examples in that video, the fact that there was some dynamism as to these pivots definitely more accurately predicted where you'd see wicks. But it is an option you can test and try yourself and come to your own conclusions about. And I'm excited to see what you come up with in Discord if you do so. So moving on, this is where we get into the use of the custom bands. So the original use case for the custom bands is the original case for this set of bands was to be able to extend the longest overexpanded period bands, because they seem to still be relevant even though there was a mean reversion. And a good example of a chart where they're actually going to see something like that happens to be the SPX daily chart, much cleaner than the recent BTC chart I use for most of my examples. So here, we see that this mean continues to be pretty well respected. It does happen to be pretty close to the daily 200 moving average in this particular case, which is part of why. But it also helps fill in an extension of what was happening over here as well. And that ended up being fairly relevant. So I don't use this band very often, but it is nice to have it as something you can look at, just setting it to show the previous longest overexpanded period, not multiplied by any factor. Just if you suspect that we're still having action dictated by the previous longest overexpanded period, which I would say is more relevant when you're using mean reversion as your condition for resetting bands than a threshold. But the reason we made the change so that this is a custom band rather than just this use case that was the original thing we had, is to look at the 1/10 standard deviation, or 1/10 LOX-P. So I have come back to the XRP ETH chart that I've previously mentioned is just a great example of a chart nobody actually trades. It's almost basically all bot arbitrage. So it's just a good thing for showing off how well volatility theory works. So we can just go into any part of this chart and kind of get an idea for what's special about this band. The concept comes from what Dad Shark has advocated for a long time, using CCI rules that are 1/10 the longest overexpanded period. So at some point we just asked, are 3.2 standard deviation bands of the 1/10 overexpanded period, longest overexpanded period, relevant? If CCI seems to be. And yeah, we found that that's a pretty useful set of bands. So what I've done in this case is these are plotted as set to LOX-P, minimum calculated period length, so display 10, multiply period length by factor, checked, multiply for custom band period length 0.1, and then the only set of bands actually checked asserts that standard deviation bands around custom check mean set to 3.2. And the repeated pattern is that these bands are a pretty good measure of how fast price can go more locally than the bands that are actually dictating the overall movement. If the theory of the case is that the longest overexpanded period is the most important band and is dictating overall movement, part of the question is how fast can we actually have a movement dictated on a given chart based on that band? Well, volatility is still expanding and contracting on lower period lengths. So for the purposes of an additional layer of risk management, looking at something much shorter than the longest overexpanded period to help us determine if we should be worried about local price action stopping us out before we actually see the move we're expecting happen, it's helpful to look at that. With the 1/10 standard deviation bands, or 1/10 LuxP 3.2 standard deviation bands, the pattern you get is that as you get approach of these bands, it's just really hard to go further. You rarely, in higher time frames, see any meaningful amount of prints outside of those bands. You'll see running along them. You'll see a wicks near them, a little bit over them, but getting past them is pretty rare. And as a result, you would not look at this mean reversion here, or this mean reversion condition activating here, and say that this is a great entry to play for mean reversion, because we have this 1/10 band that says the local expansion and contraction state is, we're so far towards the 3.2 bands that it's unlikely we're going to go in a straight line all the way up to here. And we don't. We digest this move a bit, and then we actually go through a compression range before we finally get to a mean that reversion that we then reject and continue downwards after these LuxP and TLCP bands got very squeezed. I would strongly warn about these bands because you see this and it looks really tempting to just, I'll place my orders on these bands and just use like it as a continuous range. The problem you'll run into is that twofold. One, that the possibility that we ride the band down as we're expanding, and then you're entering it here ends up being terrible, needs to be considered, where this local band is saying that short-term volatility is sort of we're going as fast as we reasonably can, but we can still go in that direction as we keep printing 4-hour bars and keep pushing out further. The other point to say about it is that as we have volatility pops, these bands can in real time just keep getting pushed further and further out as you print candles. So if you actually were to try to just set what you see in real time as a target, you would be missing the point, because as we approach it, the band could get pushed quite a bit out. What it's useful as is in real time, if we see tags of it or see wicks like this, which are going to a pivot but printing the candle below it, that's behavior that makes sense. So in real time, when we actually reach it, and assuming you're risk managing for the idea that we could be riding it, you could use it as a signal that if you want to take a counter trend entry around here, that this is a reasonable spot to do so. And the other side of the coin is that you can make a risk management determination that maybe mean reversion is implied, as we're up here, but given where we are relatively in the range, both by the 1/10 longest overexpanded period and the compression moving average, you probably wouldn't want to take long entries on shorter time frames, betting that the higher time frame is about to bring us quickly to the mean, because our relative location among compression and local volatility is towards the higher end of the range. Okay, so that brings me to labels, I believe. Yeah, so this is that 4-hour BTC USD chart that we've kept showing, and by default, only the most recent label for each period, or for each type of band is showing. They're color coded, and if an indicator is maxed out, it will print the max band as its most recent one. So in this case, you have 5 labels on the chart because both the TLCP and LuxP were maxed out on the 14 to 600, and then 600 to 2000 was tracking these 3 means at this point. They got to the longest compression mean at this point, and then their LuxP was here. It's actually 6 labels because the most recent current longest compressed period, which is being dictated right now by 14 to 600, is just currently what we have. And that's going to be typical for current longest compressed period because if it's showing at all, it means that we currently have a compression range. So what happens when we start turning on the past history of labels? So we're going to turn on display past LuxP labels, TLCP labels, CLCP labels. Well, let's go over to the 4-hour chart and look at what that looks like. So for any given instance of an indicator, PineScript will show the 50 most recent labels that your indicator calculates. And you can kind of sort of see the issue with tracking compression in particular with historical labels. Yeah, you can do it, and if you want to go back and look at what what compression states we're tracking, you'd like to have that history on your chart. But because it has this tendency to flicker in and out, that past history can overlap quite a bit as it's flickering. The other issue is that here we have 2 different period length indicators. So we actually have 2 sets of indicators printing labels on this chart. Each of them, all 3 types. So how do we scale it such that the labels don't all overlap? This is a harder mathematical problem than I'd like, and the answer is there isn't a good and easy way, so I've done the best I can to have something that works across a lot of time frames and a lot of instruments by a lot of trial and error. But the fact that there is a fair amount of overlap is why I have the default set to not show all this, and therefore if you actually want to go back and look at it, you just turn it on. You'll note one big difference between the historical labels and the current labels is that the historical labels all have white text. the current labels are color-coded the same as the mean. So at any given point, even though you have all these labels on the chart, you should be able to pick out the most recent of the period lengths that's being currently tracked. This does get us a little bit into what's going on with the weaving. Height tiers for the labels for the higher period length version of the indicator are set to 4, 5, 6, whereas lower tier version they're set to 1, 2, 3, and that's what's being used to separate them out based on the different indicator length. I've included a couple of time frames to kind of give you an idea of what this looks like trying to adapt to several time frames. And if you want to look at the historical labels, you may not get quite the scaling that you want to before you actually get a good spread. What I actually did to come up with something to relate it to price and that has scaling is that it has a normalization to average 2 range and just a lot of trial and error to try to find something that would work not just on the 4-hour and 15-minute acceptably, but like the 1 minute. And it turns out that something that takes a fixed number of pixels and can spread them out well, even wildly different relative price changes, is just tough. But the feature is there. You can look at historical labels if you toggle them, and that's how you do it. So the last thing I have loaded up is that the thing I mentioned when I went through the settings about that current summary panel. So when they launched V4 PineScript, one of the example indicators had the ability to, or had a summary panel of information. So I was like, great, I'd love to put that in ACAT. Well, it turns out that it's a real kludge. You have to actually have it relate to current price in some way mathematically to actually have it print outside and forward of price. So messing with the scaling is going to change how close it is or far it is from the current price action. You'll notice this is flickering. I have set this up to weave, but what's actually going on is that one of these two labels is a lot longer than the other, so they're overlapping, and as I move around my cursor, what it's actually displaying on the chart is sometimes maybe bringing this one forward, when I'm hovering over it instead of this. I would love to make this readout more robust and less problematic. However, it seems to only work for one of the label shapes specifically for some reason. Which is the only one that seems to accept the ability to put carriage return text in it, and I have no idea why. Maybe they come out with a change at some point and I can improve this. Until then, I'm happy to have it included in the indicator as something you can turn on, but by default it's turned off. I think it's a good summary to have, and I hope that at some point I can implement something like this in a more clean way, because it's nice to just be able to have a summary panel on your chart as to what all these values are. You'll notice that because this is two indicators woven together, for the 14 to 600, it is showing that LOXP and TLCP are maxed out. So it's showing something, but those aren't relevant. That's at the max. The custom band is set to 1/10 LOXP, since the max is 600, and that was showing 60. actual LuxB is 605, TLCP 815, and custom band 1/10 of 605 rounds to 61. So that's the odds and ends of this indicator. And this last video of the indicator series will focus on high-res ACAT and what advantages it has and a few things to look out for. But at this point, the bulk of the information on this indicator has been summarized. As of what exists right now. We've smushed together so many different additional features in this indicator since it launched that I almost expect that this will become out of date at some point, and you may find things in the menu that I didn't show today, and I'll inevitably have bugs I need to fix, and certain behaviors may change. If you ever have any questions after sitting through all these videos and trying to learn everything, and then something still doesn't seem as it was in the video, please ask us in Discord. We can probably have a good explanation and probably explain it to you much faster than it takes for you to confusedly trial and error a bunch of things until you figure out what changed. And we're happy to do so. So thanks for sitting through the videos on the core parts of this indicator, and just one last part of the series on high-res ACAT.